This episode of the show is brought to you from the Salesman.org HubSpot studio. Coming up on today's episode of the Salesman Podcast.
That when we were connecting behind a screen versus in person with the same person, we are more likely to signal less empathy. In my research over the last 5 years, writing my book, Digital Body Language, what I actually discovered is that Zoom is not just a replacement. Another example of what our digital shift has unlocked is speeding up the sales conversation. Instead of waiting 3 weeks, flying on 2 planes, we can jump on to a conversation anytime, anywhere.
Hello, Sales Nation. My name is Will Barron. I'm the host of the Salesman Podcast, the world's most downloaded B2B sales show. On today's episode, we have Erica Douan, author of Digital Body Language, the new book, which is available on Amazon and everywhere else. And that's exactly what we're talking about on today's episode. How you can show up to meetings, have more influence, reduce the chances of people misunderstanding you, and have better sales outcomes. And so with that said, let's jump right into it. Erica, welcome to the Salesman Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me here, Will.
You're more than welcome. So I'm excited to dive into this topic of, and I love the way you've kind of branded it and chose this name here, digital body language. We're going to dive into that. But first, before we get into perhaps how we can improve our own digital body language, which is what we're all here for, right? What's going on in the buyer's brain? What's going on in the buyer's brain when we engage with them on Zoom versus when we engage with them in person? What's the difference that's going on inside them between those two environments?
We all know that roughly 70% of communication is our nonverbal body language. But in a world where roughly now 70 to 100% of our sales conversations are virtual, there are massive differences in how the buyer's brain is reacting to our selling and marketing. For example, a recent research study called the Online Disinhibition Effect showed that when we were connecting behind a screen versus in person with the same person, we are more likely to signal less empathy to that other person behind a screen than in person. Second, I like to say in today's world, we are much more likely to misunderstand each other quickly in the world of screen freezes, echoes, delays, and also the fact that it's not natural to see our own video camera on the screen while we're trying to engage with someone else. We often miss the lean in, the direct eye contact, the head nod that allows us to act with curiosity, to engage, or to shift the conversation if required. And lastly, the third thing that's happening in the buyer's brain is often reading into signals we may be sending, even if we don't intend to, that are often different than the shrugged shoulder, the head nod, the furrowed brows, that were very common to react to instantly. We don't have that synchronicity in real-time feedback, whether it's delays in technology or the fact that screen freezes or gallery view make it difficult. There is much more pausing in between that makes it much more difficult to have that creative flow of conversation in the modern sales conversation.
So clearly there's a whole host that we can go into strategy-wise, or how we need to change how we do these calls, perhaps to perhaps take advantage of the platform, the access that we do have. But with that said, are we just inherently less likely to have a strong conversation through a Zoom call or a Skype call, or is there an opportunity to have just as good a call as what we would do in person?
In my research over the last 5 years, writing my book, Digital Body Language, what I actually discovered is that Zoom is not just a replacement when we can't be face-to-face. It can actually deepen, enhance, and improve the modern sales conversation, whether we can be face-to-face or we would like to meet virtually. One of the things that I've seen, particularly over the last year, is new and creative ways we can transform the sales conversation to actually speed up trust and connection. For example, with many of my sales division clients, one of the best practices we've been doing is in the modern sales conversation, 30 minutes over Zoom. Many salespeople are zooming in an existing customer to talk to a prospect for 5 minutes about their experience with that service provider. And what this does is it radically improves and speeds up the trust building with the prospect. However, this was never happening previous to the pandemic in the sales conversation that was often a coffee chat. But today we can zoom in individuals in a much faster way. Another example of what our digital shift has unlocked is speeding up the sales conversation. Instead of waiting 3 weeks, flying on 2 planes, we can jump on to a conversation anytime, anywhere. And the reality is many salespeople were already ready to do that. But I think on the buyer end, they're more apt and willing and comfortable to do that now. The other thing that we're not waiting for is to have all the right decision makers in the room. We don't have to just have one conversation and then 3 more sales conversations. Ideally, on the buyer end, they have all their team members zooming into that conversation quickly so that you can get to an answer faster. Those are just some examples of the power of how we can use the modern phone or video meeting to reimagine sales in the future. And I think my argument is that when we are willing and able to use digital body language in smarter ways, we can actually be more effective salespeople as we move into the 21st century.
I love it. So we'll get into the practical elements of some of this in a second, Erica. But I've got one question. With your 5 years of research, and I can probably add a few anecdotes to this, having done the podcast over Skype for 6 years now. Has anything massively changed over that period with regards to whether it's buyer-seller relationships via video calls or whatever it is? Has there anything that's massively changed over that period other than the obvious changes in the past 12, 18 months?
I think when it comes to the buyer-seller relationship, the obvious change is that both parties are much more comfortable buying and selling online through relationships rather than in person. And I can't tell you, as I've seen, if you go back to 2017, 2018, 2019, how much resistance there was to buying a product or service unless you had met in person, and how much expectation there was to fly down on a plane or make something happen with your whole team present in a boardroom. I think the rules have been disrupted, and what that is allowing for, and I think more of the exciting moment of what's changed, is the willingness for the buyer and seller relationship to modernize and innovate is what I think is the most exciting, unique aspect of the last year.
For sure. And I'll add, this is an N=1 experiment, right? It's worth what it is worth. But I know when I started doing this interview series, kind of like 6 years ago now, that's 700, I think we're like 750 episodes in, nobody wanted to do video. People barely knew what a podcast was, but you could convince them to get on an audio podcast. And then they'd jump on and be like, well, why do I need to be on video? Well, people didn't even really understand what YouTube was. YouTube was massive, clearly, at that point in time. But from the business perspective, and not people doing stupid things to get millions of views and vlogging and Casey Neistat and all that kind of thing that was hot at the time, there was very few people who were willing to put business content on YouTube, and very few people who were willing to contribute to business content, whether it be interviews or whatever it was. And I found slowly over the years, it becomes more and more ubiquitous that people would get on a podcast. Then people would then be happy to do the video, and people were set up to do the video as well. So you've got great lighting, and you've got a decent microphone and all this kind of stuff. That didn't exist for most people a few years ago. And now the final twist of all of this is, now that everyone's using Zoom, and Skype has just copied a bunch of Zoom features, and Microsoft Teams, which is kind of the backbone of Skype, right? It's become easier and easier just to send someone a link that they click on. They don't have to install Skype. It's now just so simple to get people on these video calls that I've literally seen that transition over the past 4 or 5 years. So I can only assume it's the same if you were a salesperson a few years ago trying to get a hold of a buyer and jump on a video call rather than get on a flight. The resistance there must have been massive versus what it is now. Is that fair to say?
I think that is exactly right. And what I foresee as we go back to work at some point this year, next year, is that the future of the sales conversation may be back to face to some level, but there will be a lot of buyers who will want to start with the video call. And there will also be a lot of buyers or buyer and seller conversations where certain people will be in the room together and certain people will be on the video screens around the room. And so digital body language is not just about how do we connect and sell when we're connecting virtually on video calls. It's about how do we make others feel in a modern marketplace. I'll give you an example. Pre-pandemic, I was on a call. There were 3 of us that were remote and 3 people that were in the office. And it wasn't until the 26th minute of a 30-minute meeting that someone in the office said, "Does anyone on the phone have anything to share?" We are so visually biased to who's in front of us. And so there's an opportunity here for that salesperson to read cues even better and reimagine how to speed up that sales conversation to achieve their goals in a modern marketplace using video, in person, phone, all of these modalities in the right ways.
So as you say that, I imagine this is so ridiculous because we could do it right now. The new Salesman.org studio is going to be more like this. As I tease the audience with that because it's coming in the next few months. But I visualize this boardroom with multiple screens, and Sally's not in today. She's on the screen, and there's this and this and this, and we're all sat around a table, and it's almost a screen talking in, and you're looking at Sally, and then you're looking at Barry, and then there's Harry over there who's actually in the room. Are we wired to, if we were in that scenario where there's literally a screen, the audio is coming from that place as well, so we're doing a little bit to trick our brain that there's someone there. Are we still wired to somewhat ignore the individuals on the screen and pay attention to the individual in the room? Is our brain wired, or is there cognitive biases or anything like that that forces us to add kind of sensory priority to people who are actually there?
We are absolutely wired to pay more attention to individuals that are in the room with us, to individuals that have a deeper voice pitch or are taller, more of the majority in the room. Even just where they stand in that boardroom or sit in that boardroom shapes who we pay attention to. So you can imagine if you have a couple of screens where bodies are not present, we are more likely neurologically to not pay as much attention. But I'm here to help you with that. And in my book, Digital Body Language, I actually share some best practices around how you can be more inclusive in those meetings to make sure that you are engaging everyone to get to the best answers. For example, when you have a conversation with where some people are in the office and some people are on that video call or that live stream or even on the conference call, one of the best practices is to switch up meeting hosts for different parts of the agenda and actually have a remote person lead parts of the agenda, especially at the beginning of the meeting. What this instantly does is it removes that visual bias and allows us to pay attention to the audio cues. Another thing you can do is if you have a sales presentation and then you want to get perspectives from people, instead of just hearing the questions instantly from individuals in that office room, instead start with the people on the phone or on video and say, let's start with questions remotely, and then we'll come back to the room. What you'll find is you'll get more of a diversity of questions. You'll understand the different cues and signals of what individuals are really thinking versus all the nodding heads in the room. And these are just simple practices, but I think that in many ways, our last year of digital selling and marketing is going to allow us to be even better salespeople in the future.
So I've got a conundrum. It's slightly off topic and lighthearted, but you might be able to help with this. Right. I'm 6'3", and I was reading a statistic the other day, and it was something like, I'm going to butcher the numbers here slightly, so I'll put them in the show notes, the accurate numbers, but it was something like 5% of people in America are over 6 foot, and 40% of CEOs and executives in America are men over 6'3" or something like that. So it seems like, and you mentioned this, that tone of voice, the deepness of your voice, and height leads to more persuasion when you're in a physical conversation. It seems like I should be wanting to leverage my height. And in video calls, this is something that people get wrong with all the time. It's hilarious. When I meet people in person, the first thing that everyone says to me is, bloody hell, you're tall. Because on video, obviously, you can't tell this. Now, I could just, I'll do it now. I could just raise my seat up and or just go much higher. But I'd be like cutting my head off at the top of the table, right? Or I could lower the table and make myself like perceived to be taller or shorter than what I actually am. But, and obviously, I'm half joking as I say this, but is there anything like your height, or is there any way to even like manipulate your voice to make it seem slightly deeper or more not more articulate, but is there any way we can use other things that people perhaps aren't thinking about to increase our levels of influence on a call or in a sales conversation beyond the obvious, I guess?
The exciting news is just like we need to fight the unconscious biases in the traditional face-to-face sales conversation, there are a whole new set of actually digital body language biases. And in part 3 of my book, I talk about digital body language biases across genders, generations, and cultures. And it's very useful for you, Will, and others that are quite tall, where some of that was actually better for them face to face, so that they can reinforce and show confidence and charisma and presence in the virtual setting. I have a great table that says, what does executive presence look like digitally? And some tips for you is that there are some general biases that show up in a virtual world that are different. For example, name bias. If we get an email from Ian Smith versus Ravindra Subramanian, there is an instant reaction. If we are Indian, we may more likely be gravitating towards the Indian name. If we are British or American, maybe we gravitate more towards Ian. That's just one example. Another example is a recent study showed that women that use multiple emojis or exclamations in corporate messaging compared to a man at any age that are using those emotive cues, women are more likely to be seen as incompetent. Men are more likely to be seen at all ages as casual or friendly. These are just simple new digital body language biases that emerge. So how do we foster inclusion and how do we all get better at this? The good news is that we can fight these biases and we can all be better at this. And I have sort of 3 rules around how to be better at digital body language. The first rule is what I like to say is reading carefully is the new listening. In today's world, instead of just relying on our executive presence or our charisma, we have to understand that reading the signals of others, asking them thoughtful questions, actually reading their emails and what they ask for versus rushing to respond shows people that we are listening and that we care. The second key tip is what I like to say is writing or in speaking clearly is the new empathy. So instead of just having a loud voice or being tall, today, really being maniacally clear. I like to say, even in emails, visually showcasing your email because people read messages visually now, making sure your slides in that screen share in the Zoom meeting are really clear, not just a laundry list, so that people can sense make. So think about your messages almost like websites and getting to that headline at the top, giving people exactly what they need, whether it's bold and underlined headings, that can simply allow you to get your message across and help people to actually feel empathy from you, because we can't often feel that empathy behind a screen otherwise. And then the third best tip I want to share on this is what I like to say, a video or phone call is worth 1,000 emails. So if you can, and we're already talking about it, try to get those additional cues, audio cues, visual cues on video. It's important, obviously, to send thoughtful emails in advance and to use those emails to actually prepare people to have a more meaningful sales conversation. But if we're not being thoughtful about it, we'll just get stuck in email flows and often lose engagement.
Have you come across or even read perhaps the book On Writing Well?
Yes, I actually just was rereading it last week because as I'm deep in the throes of launching a book, writing to persuade is the key. And I think that now it's just a skill. What salespeople often relied on in the past is still important, but I would argue that writing well matters even more now.
Yep, I agree. So I'll link On Writing Well in the show notes if anyone wants to pick it up. But that book really changed my paradigm with regards to communication in general. It tells you to just strip words from the page or the email, whatever it is, that don't need to be there. And when I first started writing posts over at salesman.org, and obviously been published all over the place now, I would almost write fancifully. I don't think that's a real word. I've just made it up. Kind of contradicting what the point I'm making here. I'd write and I'd use kind of $10 words when 2-cent words would make more sense, and that really changed my perception of all of this. As soon as I started writing simply and started writing as basic as I could, I didn't find that people thought I was oversimplifying things. I got more back from people because it sunk in. So with that said, on a page, I feel like there's rules that we can learn. There's things that we can do. There's strategies that we can put to practice, and that book is a great resource for this. Digitally, On a video call, is there anything that we can do other than the obvious of perhaps having a better microphone so people can very literally hear us at a higher quality and they can understand our voice tonality and all that kind of stuff, assuming that we're in a decent place with some of that to begin with? Is there anything else that we can do to help our legibility when we're talking kind of audio into a computer, out of another computer, into a headphone, into someone's brain?
There are a few things that all of us can do to better get our message across in audio, in video, in the modern sales conversation. And before I share those, I'm going to use a story to help put the tips into practice. I was working with a large bank, and there was a steering committee, and there are 4 people on the steering committee. There's a British woman in the UK, there is an American woman in New York, there is a team member in Sydney, Australia, and there is a man, Javier, who is in Rio in Brazil. And during multiple monthly steering committee meetings, they would all get together to have conversations and make decisions. And Lainey, who was a member, the New York team member of the Global Steering Committee, kept getting frustrated because she found like Javier was not engaging. He was not speaking up. She assumed he was just disinterested. Finally, one day, she got the courage to chat him privately on Zoom during the Zoom call to say, is everything okay? Do you have any thoughts on this? And from that, she immediately got a response in chat from Javier saying, I'm having such a hard time translating 3 different English accents, an American accent, a British accent, and an Australian accent at the same time. So this is just an example of the fact that we have to acknowledge our own biases of how we like to connect and understand how we can connect better with those that may be different from us. If we're a man selling to women, if we're a baby boomer selling to millennials, if we're, cross-cultural, like the example I just shared. And I think this is a real great moment to check our own biases and understand that we have to have beautiful digital body language that is inclusive to be able to thrive in today's sales marketplace. So I want to give a couple of best practices here to help you around this. The first one is I like to say the meeting doesn't start in the meeting. The first impression, we all know research shows, was the first roughly 7 seconds we met someone, less than 7 seconds. I think it was 7 milliseconds that we met someone. We made an instant first impression. I like to say that the new first impression is in the meeting invitation. Did you have a clear subject line of the title of your meeting? Simple things like that can create intentionality. Did you have a clear agenda? Did you send out all the relevant information before? Did you maybe share a video that someone could watch to get a sense of it? I like to say create the Netflix or Hulu-like experience where people can learn about your product or service anytime, anywhere before you lecture at them during a Zoom call. And simple things like that pre-meeting can go a long way in speeding up that trust building during the conversation. Secondly, during the conversation, depending on how many people you have, you may be presenting to 10 people, you may be presenting to 1 person, and this is where it may depend on what to do. Understand how you can engage them immediately in sharing with you and try to be thoughtful around it. I would encourage you not to start with how's the weather, how's it over there? I mean, let's be honest, they're not as exciting questions, but to dive into and ask them, what's meaningful to you or what does success look like for you? Actually, shifting your questions to be a little more thoughtful can be helpful. And obviously, if you've never met this person before, it's important to have some icebreakers or breaking some barriers, but find something that's a bit more authentic and different for you. And then during the meeting, make sure, especially if you're presenting or pitching to a large group of people, maybe 5 or more individuals, actively use the chat tool. Say, I'm going to walk us through about 6 minutes of a conversation and make sure people know where you're going orally, but also visually through effective screen shares of slides. And then say, I'd love to get your questions in the chat, and then I'll come back to them, or I have multiple screens. But having an agenda where people feel like they can participate can go a long way in driving that engagement. And then I like to say, instead of saying, what do you think? Or do you have any questions? Asking them targeted questions to start with. Even in my own keynotes, I never start with, what questions do you have? I leave them with, what are your priorities? How can this idea help serve, or this product or service help serve your priorities? And when you ask them thoughtful questions, they'll really be forced to share and give you feedback and think with you. And then you can move into more of that traditional Q&A. Those are
Sure.
just some examples. But again, some of these have already worked pre-pandemic, but maybe we weren't as thoughtful about them as we can be now.
I think it goes beyond thoughtful as well. It's just people's understanding of the software and the tools. So I love the idea of chat, especially when you're engaging with multiple people, because some people don't want to talk over others. You might have individuals that are more shy or introverted, or however you want to frame it up in the conversation. You perhaps have, especially if you're in the boardroom setting, if you're in sales, you might have an executive who's going back and forth with the salesperson, or maybe the end user actually has a few things to say, but they don't want to step on their executives, their CEO's toes. So a quick chat message that hopefully is being moderated by both the salesperson perhaps running the meeting, but then maybe you've got someone technical who can feed questions back to the salesperson at the end. I think that's really valuable, because 5 years ago, no one would have been able to do any of this because no one knows where the chat button is on any of these platforms. But now that we're all using it so often, and there's more virtual conferences that are leveraging all these tools, and there's more internal meetings that are going on these tools, as well as sales calls and things like that. I think more people are more understanding of it. So I want to get onto, we'll perhaps wrap up the show with self-awareness in a second. I'm going to put you on the spot slightly, Erica. Now, this is a safe space, right? You can say whatever you want. You're not going to offend me. When we talk about, or when you were talking about bringing people on board and first impressions, was there anything that I did and the team over at Salesman.org did right or wrong with the onboarding that we did with you before this call itself? So feel free, if we have to something wrong, do let it riff. Feel free to kind of have a go at us, or did we do an okay job here? How did we do?
Will, I mean, you're top class when it comes to effective digital body language. Let me give a few examples of why you are. The first thing is that in our immediate introduction, you had a Calendly where I could sign up for a slot. Instead of 4 or 5 back and forth emails where if I was on the buyer side, I could get tired or, be in the world of email fatigue and just give up. You gave me an easy way to set up a call with you. Secondly, you shared an FAQ link, which gave me an understanding of what was important to you. A simple link like that, that's a one-stop shop. We don't want 5 links. We want one link that will allow us to know how to prepare for that conversation, can go a long way in driving better conversations and sales in our modern marketplace. The third thing you did is you sent me a reminder this morning. And that's really important. We're booking calls 3-4 weeks out, 3-4 months out. And so now actually having that immediate checkpoint, the email that from you came early this morning was perfect because it helped me set the agenda, reorient, know exactly what we wanted to focus on today, and included all the relevant links. And the last thing is you are perfectly on time when we join the call. Let's be honest. I think that promptness matters, and there's a bit more of impatience of individuals than we were face to face. We could be 5 minutes late to starting the sales conversation. Now, I do think that valuing people visibly is valuing their time. And so showing your promptness will signal that presence and trust with someone else.
Love it. I appreciate that. The FAQ, I probably stole it from someone. I don't think I was the first to do that, right? To onboard someone onto a call. But the FAQ is incredibly frequently asked questions for anyone who's familiar with the term. But it's incredibly important if you're doing sales demos. So you're not just jumping on a sales call, you're doing a demo. You can tee someone up, you can give them a series of videos that if they're super keen, they can watch before the demo itself. So when you get into the demo, you can then start your demo with, hey, what do you want me to focus on? What do you want us to drill down on? What's stopping you from moving forward with this immediately, as opposed to, hi, my name is Bob. I'm going to run through this software demo and then we're going to suck it up. You're going to turn your camera off halfway through because you're off going to the toilet and having a cup of tea and I'm talking to no one. You can eliminate quite a lot of that by having great media and content before the call itself. So I appreciate that. I appreciate the feedback. Is there anything that we could have done better?
And the one great thing is we can record these calls. So if people miss them, they can follow up. I had always been promoting send a video pre the meeting beforehand and design your conversation that's live as a workshop, as a brainstorming session. And I think this is something that I even featured in my last book, Get Big Things Done, which came out a few years ago. But I think that now we're just seeing the importance of it even more. And if you can't do something perfect, just do a live a video recording and send it to them in advance, even if it's personalized. That can go a long way in just building your credibility.
For sure. And this seems like a weird thing, right? But obviously we've I think we've gone back over email, but we've never met before. It can be awkward to sit down and it's the wrong person sat in front of you and you don't realize because you've not seen them, or hopefully you've done your research on LinkedIn, wherever it is. But if you're dealing with middle management in some enterprise company, maybe they don't have an updated LinkedIn profile. Maybe they don't have this and this. So for you to send a quick video over just so they can the buyer can familiarize themselves with you and your voice and how you're going to show up, that could be valuable. And just on the being on time side of things, I don't allow myself not to be on time. And for the audience, and you probably sussed this out, but we send a Skype meeting link 5 minutes before the start time of the show. And then I just sit there from that moment in time that the email goes over, just staring at the screen, waiting for the guest to join. So there is no chance that I can be late for the meeting because I'm literally there hosting it 5 minutes before. And if you don't have that 5 minutes for an important meeting, then you're doing probably other things wrong, and that's the least of your worries. So with that said, Erica, I feel like a lot of what we're talking about here, it comes down to self-awareness, as opposed to, we've covered lots of practical things, but as opposed to old school body language stuff. It would be, mirror the person you're meeting with, sit next to them, as opposed to like allow them to sit opposite you because they've got control of the influence of the big desk that they're sat behind, all that kind of stuff. Is self-awareness a key part to this? And is there anything that we can do to increase our levels of self-awareness before we go into an important meeting and get feedback that we've done it all wrong? What can we do to make sure that we've got this right before we experiment on a customer?
Yes. So I like to say that body language hasn't been removed or isn't absent. It's transformed in the modern marketplace. And digital body language makes up much of the cues and signals we send. And self-awareness is really the critical piece of that. Are we being self-aware of the digital body language signals we're sending? Are we making sure that we're reading cues of others correctly versus getting caught up in our own biases? And I want to give you 4 key laws of digital body language that will help you improve your self-awareness. These are also in part 2 of my new book, Digital Body Language, where I go through them in a deeper dive. And I also have a little assessment in my book so that you can measure yourself as a salesperson around each of these 4 laws. The first law is what I like to say, and I mentioned this before, value visibly. In the past, in the old school world of body language, valuing others visibly meant direct eye contact, head nod, that firm handshake in the room. Today, valuing visibly is starting on time, ending on time, acknowledging introverts and extroverts, being thoughtful of what you said before the meeting, and showing that radical recognition, giving credit where it's due in writing and verbally. The second law is communicating carefully. Self-awareness today is all about making sure we're communicating thoughtfully. So I'll give you an example. One of my clients, he sent a text message to his boss, Tom, that said, "Do you want to speak Wednesday or Thursday?" And Tom's response was, "Yes." And as I said earlier, reading carefully is the new listening and writing clearly is the new empathy. And there's really no room to mistake this. We all give grace, but we're 1 year into the pandemic. We have to reimagine and modernize our skills. The third law is what I like to call collaborate confidently. So confidence in the sales conversation is not just about your charisma, your voice pitch, your height, how you use your hands, how you showcase a presentation. It's about saying what you'll do and doing what you'll say. It's about being thoughtful of including others across all of the different virtual channels. And it's also about just remembering that what you may be sending may not be the same on the other side, and to take that extra level to be curious of what people need, reimagining your conversation, not as a pitch, but as a brainstorming session. And then the 4th key law is what I like to call trust totally. And what that means is we just have to assume the best intent. We may not hear from buyers for weeks, for months. We may be dealing with sending messages again and again, having to follow up without feeling like a nag. But in today's world, we have to understand and give grace, give people the benefit of the doubt, and use thoughtful follow-ups as a way to get our message across.
I love it. And I'll wrap up with a lot of that comes back down to self-awareness, right? As you say all of this, Two of those points I've been really poignantly sharing with one of over at salesman.org. We've got in our training program, we have a community, and there's one chap in there right at this moment. I'll say this now because this show is going to go out a few weeks after this conversation's happening, so we'll be able to track it down to who I'm talking about. He's very much like I've sent these emails and no one's replied. It feels burdened that people haven't got back to him. So I asked him to share the messages, and they were terrible. Now, obviously, we can coach him to send better messages, and that's what we're doing. But also his mindset of he had very little self-awareness. There's very little self-responsibility or accountability for his actions. And that was the key training point. The messages, that's easy to change. You can read books on it. There's tons of content on how to send a good sales email. But you got to have the right mindset and self-awareness behind it to understand that people are busy. People are getting spammed left, right, and every which way at the moment, and everyone's trying to jump on meetings, whether it's virtually, in person, phone, whatever it is. And so the key learning point for him was just that little bit of self-awareness, and then the thought process of I'll follow up in a week. I've got no doubt, because he's got a great product and a great the way he's pitching it is not too bad at all. He's going to have great success. But it was just that self-awareness to understand what the buyers are going through right now and the transformation that they're going through. We think we're going through transformation. They're getting transformed at even a faster pace than what we are, because we're doing the same thing over and over and every day. They're seeing these transformations happen, one meeting, 2 meetings, 3 meetings, and they're seeing massive gaps in between each one. So we've got to have empathy for that, as opposed to, I think, salespeople see it in a more gradual fade-in process. So maybe we're more acclimatized to it. So, Mike, what I've really taken away from this episode, Erica, is all the practical stuff, but self-awareness as well. Clearly, if you're speaking to someone who is from a different culture, doesn't quite understand the English isn't their first language, whatever it is, the burden is on us to take responsibility for that and to hopefully improve our ability to communicate and to really double down on it. And with that, Eric, I want you to tell us about the book. And also, when you mentioned about the book, you mentioned earlier on how many years you've been researching this. Tell us about that as well, because I think that's critically important, because there's lots of books coming out that have similar titles and similar topics right now, but clearly yours is far more in-depth research, and you've been pondering on this for longer than perhaps some of the other content that's coming out on this subject right now.
I like to say I've been a lifelong student of the world of body language and digital body language. I grew up in an immigrant household. My family's from India. I grew up in Pennsylvania. And I was a shy and introverted girl and struggled to find my voice. And it helped me develop a knack for body language and understanding cues and signals of what allowed people to get heard. And I think what I saw in the last 10 years through my research on collaboration was that today we're all immigrants to the new world of digital body language. We don't have a rule book. We're all in a foreign world. And that really guided my passion over the last years to study digital body language well before the pandemic, and then the acceleration of it during the pandemic. And so my new book, Digital Body Language, How to Build Trust and Connection No Matter the Distance, is out and available. You can get it anywhere, Amazon, Barnes & Noble's, in Indie, you name it. I hope you'll order a copy and share it with your teams, share it with your clients and customers, because I believe in this moment in time, we can all reimagine how we work together, even when we're apart, and as we move back to being together again in the future. And I also have a special online community where you can get regular best practices around digital body language. If you go to my website at ericadewan.com/digital body language, what I include there is a free digital body language toolkit with best practices in video and phone calls and email that you can download. Also, a tool called End Digital Burnout, which will allow you to avoid just the dearth of being on the screen all the time, and a digital body language quiz, so you can assess your own style and compare that to others, which is just a great exercise so that you can be conscious of yourself, but also biases you may have when connecting with people different from you.
Amazing stuff. Well, I'll link to all that in the show notes of this episode, even over at salesman.org. I need to work on my communication here on the very podcast that we're talking about, Erica. And with that, I want to thank you again for joining us on the Salesman Podcast.
Thank you so much.